Give me 5 seconds and away you go. You're good to go.
Okay, good evening everyone. My name is Doug Chipman, Mayor of the City of Clarence, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's online council meeting. Could those please lower your head for the council prayer. Almighty God, we humbly beseech thee to vouchsafe thy blessing upon this council. Direct and prosper its deliberations to the advancement of thy glory and the true welfare of the people of the City of Clarence. Amen. I'd like to acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet tonight. I pay respects to elders past and present and recognise their continuing spiritual connection with the land. This virtual meeting via Teams is being broadcast live on YouTube, and what is said in this meeting is not protected by privilege. There is a link to the agenda papers on Council's website. Questions and answers and deputations would normally be received and read by the General Manager, but tonight we have no questions or deputations from members of the public. I'd also like to advise that we are monitoring the COVID situation very carefully with a view to being back in the chamber physically as soon as we can, with members of the public in attendance as well. First of all, I note that we have a full house, therefore there are no apologies. Secondly, I would ask for any declarations of interests of Alderman or close associate.
Mr Mayor, I wish to make a declaration for Planning Authority item 6.3.
Thank you. Are there any other declarations of interest? In that case, we'll move to item 3, the omnibus items. There are 8 items there. We'll go through those one at a time and then call for one mover and a seconder and one vote on those 8 items. Firstly, the confirmation of minutes from the 17th of January as circulated be taken as read and confirmed. There are no questions on the previous minutes. I have and will table again the significant appointments and representational tasks of myself, a Deputy Mayor and other Aldermen. 3.3, the Council notes the workshop conducted on the 31st of January and the agenda brief on the 4th of February. We have no petitions tabled for tonight.
Mr Mayor, Council workshops, did you want to take a question on that?
I can take a question on that, Alderman James. Certainly, go ahead.
52 Richardson's Road, urban growth boundary consultation results. Is it the intention of the General Manager to publish the survey results so that residents can access that detail on Council's website?
General Manager.
Through you, Mayor. Thank you. Yes, those results are either published or due to be published shortly. Mr Pask may be able to give us a date.
Through you, Mr Mayor, we intend to publish those first thing tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No other questions in regard to the workshops? As I mentioned, there are no petitions tabled. Reports from outside bodies for a copying reuse facility. We have the December quarterly report. Alderman Walker, did you wish to add anything at this point?
Just the unfortunate nature of prudence means that a scheduled on-site visit for elected representatives couldn't be held this Thursday. It's a significant piece of infrastructure. I think it'd be really great for people to be able to go down there to see the power generation and all those good things that are happening at this site. So hopefully this is something we'll be able to do in May.
Thank you. In regard to Taswater, on the 3rd last week, I attended the quarterly report to the owners' representatives, and the quarterly report is included in the agenda papers. Hobart Committee, I've got nothing to report there. Moving on to 3.6 reports from single and joint authorities. Are there, I have reported already on those 3, but are there any other reports? Thank you. Moving on to 3.8, the weekly briefing reports, that Council notes the information contained in the reports of the 17th, 21st and 31st of January. Any questions on the weekly briefing reports? In that case, could I have a move and a second that the officer's recommendations be adopted for those 8 items? Thank you, Alderman Warren. Seconded, Alderman Pearce. Could everyone in favour of that motion please raise their hand electronically? Carried unanimously. Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, we have no questions from members of the public or deputations by members of the public. So I'd like to advise that Council now intends to sit as a planning authority under the Land Use Planning and Approvals Act. The first item there, 6.1, is a development application at 53A 7 Mile Beach Road for a dwelling. Could I have a move and a seconder, please? Alderman Yerington, thank you. Alderman Kennedy seconded it. Alderman Yerington, would you like to speak to it?
No, Mr. Mayor, I think the officer's recommendations are quite clear in relation to how it complies, and I'd encourage my colleagues to support it.
Thank you. Alderman Kennedy. You are muted, Alderman Kennedy.
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor. That was a slight accident, but I'm happy to second the motion.
Thank you. Did you wish to add further to the debate on that issue, or happy just leave it?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Alderman James, you wish to speak to the motion?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, but before I do, I would like to pose a question through you to Mr. Lovell. Mr. Lovell, there has been a significant change in relation to the clauses 10.4.1 and 11C11.4.1 with regard to coastal inundation hazard and the coastal erosion hazard code. How are they now to be picked up, given that they cannot be basically included in any condition with respect to this particular development? How is the actual, able to be picked up in relation to a outside qualified person to deal with this, please?
Through Mr. Mayor, provided a detailed discussion on this previously, so I won't go into great detail if that's satisfactory. Let me just say that under the state planning controls, under our LPS, if these controls are subject to a permit under another piece of legislation, in particular the Building Act and regulations operating in Tasmania, then those controls override the planning scheme, and so they become there's no planning assessment of them. It's left to a later date to be assessed by the building surveyor or other consultants.
Thank you. Did you wish to continue with your debate, please, Alderman James?
Yes, Mr. Mayor. Look, I support the officer's recommendation and in a sense reluctantly, because those two, coastal inundation hazard and the coastal erosion hazard code, have been a really important part, I would think, of any potential climate change that may filter through into the city as part of the planning system. And given that it's now taken out of the hands of the planning authority, which is the Clarence City Council in this particular instance, it's now left with a suitably qualified expert or a building surveyor. And hopefully he or she may be able to gauge as to whether this is a suitable development. And if not, they may make a determination that it's contrary to, and therefore a new planning permit may be required. So, Mr. Mayor, it's really left now to a qualified building surveyor to determine as to whether or not those particular codes are appropriate, or whether that particular building is appropriate for development in that particular area. So it's a bit of a shame, I think, Mr. Mayor, that this has now been taken out of, well, under the building regulations, under the Building Act 2016, away from the planning authority, which I thought is the really important as part of any coastal inundation or any matter that pertains to erosion hazard risk within the City of Clarence.
Thank you, Alderman James. Any other speakers? In that case, is there any?
Mr. Mayor,
Alderman Von Berto? Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to concur with Alderman James. I think what he has said encapsulates my concerns. I think this is a very backward move in terms of looking at issues related to flooding, erosion, inundation. So I am very much in agreement with Alderman James. Thank you.
Thank you. Alderman Pearce.
Thank you, Mayor, and I concur with the last two speakers, Mayor, but really, when I went and had a look at the site, and Part B of the recommendation, I think, does say it all, but also in Part A, the finished floor level of all habitable floors must be 300 mils above the designated flood level for that land. And when I read the report, I just thought, well, it's a tick here and a tick there, so I support the recommendation.
Thank you. Are there any other speakers? Right, a reply, Alderman Ewington.
No need for that, Mr. Mayor.
In that case, I'll put the motion which is recommending approval, subject to conditions and advice. All those in favour, please raise their electronic hand. Against?
I'll just take the hands down, Mayor, and then we can have against.
All those against? I have one against. So the motion is carried. Thank you.
It wasn't me.
No, it wasn't. If I could now move on to item 6.2, development application at 64 Surf Road, 7 Mile Beach for a dwelling. Move in a seconder, please.
Mr. Mayor, I propose.
Yes, thank you. Do I have a seconder, please? Alderman Ewington, thank you. Alderman Pearce.
Thank you, Mayor. As you know, I do not always support things at 7 Mile Beach, but having a look at this and reading the report, I think what the applicants intended to do is exactly that I would, if I had that land, if I want to do something with it, that's exactly what I'd want to do with it. So when I read page 62 and 5.3, the comment there, Mayor, I see nothing wrong with this, so I'm going to support the motion.
Thank you. Alderman Ewington.
Yeah, look, Mr. Mayor, I mean, the problem we've got with any planning scheme or situation like this is to try and describe a way to deal with every possible scenario and be consistent in things. You know, I know there's been some concern expressed about lot coverage and those sort of things, but I mean, the critical thing that I saw in the report was basically, I mean, that there's no impact on the habitable rooms of the other dwellings nearby. The building have done their best to try and minimise impact on their neighbours. You know, it's a small lot. You know, with the intention was it was, you know, subdivided to allow another dwelling to be in there. And we all know that 7 Mile Beach is a popular area, and I think that the report by the planners covers all the boxes, and I'd encourage my colleagues to support this one as well.
Thank you. Alderman Mulder.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I had my hand raised when I called the motion because I was planning to remove the foreshadow, but I will the alternative. However, I will foreshadow that should this motion be lost, I will move that particular motion. Mr. Mayor, this application should be refused because it's of non-compliance with clause 10.4.3A2, in that the siting of the dwelling causes unreasonable loss of amenity to adjoining properties, and also clause 10.4.4A1, in that the site coverage exceeds the 30% maximum allowed by the low density zone in which this building is located. Mr. Mayor, my issue with the thing is that this is a sub-minimal lot size in the low density residential zone. The proposal is to build a large 2-storey house that exceeds site coverage and causes unreasonable loss of amenity. The assessment of the performance criteria is addressed in my alternative motion, but suffice to say that the concerns of the representatives could have been addressed were the building relocated closer to Surf Road, as are the adjoining buildings. This could have been addressed by consulting with neighbours, and we would not find ourselves in this position. And I firmly believe that were we to refuse this motion and pass the alternative, that sort of negotiation would occur at any future meeting. So the difficulties are that it is a size, but it's also the fact that we could have danced around the non-conformity with a little bit of discussion and a little bit of consulting, which I hope will happen should this matter go to mediation.
Thank you, Alderman Mulder. Are there any other speakers?
I'm trying to check my...
I've got Alderman Kennedy next, and then Alderman James.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have similar concerns as Alderman Mulder. 10.4.4A1, that the site coverage exceeds that allowed by the low density zoning. So that is my concern.
Thank you, Alderman James.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I visited the site on Sunday and observed where this new building is proposed to be built. It's contrary to the low density residential zone, clause 10.4.3, A2, in as much as that the setback, the southern side boundary, and the 4.97 metre from the northern side boundary is less than the 5 metre minimum setback required under the acceptable solution. And also the fact of that being set back, which is less than the minimum 5 metre, it's going to basically cause loss of amenity with respect to the adjoining building, and it doesn't conform with the other buildings that actually align on that same sort of frontage with the other buildings along Surf Road immediately next door to the proposed site. The other factor in this is that in accordance with the low density residential zone, the proposed dwelling would have a site coverage of 33%, which is more than the maximum site coverage of 30% required by the acceptable solution. And having said that, it's also been addressed that that does cause concern, and in the officer's report does refer to the fact that this is makes it difficult to maintain on page 58, part C, and I quote, "The size of the lot makes it difficult to maintain the required site coverage of 30%. The proposed dwelling would be of a size and shape compatible with the rectangular shape of the lot, but nevertheless, it's still very difficult to fit and obviously try to have that building, the two-storey building, within that, well, to meet that site coverage of 33%, and therefore the officers are recommending that there be a discretion and therefore it be basically covered in that 30%, that it exceed the 33, and therefore 30% is acceptable. I will not support the recommendation."
Thank you, Alderman James. I have no other speakers at this stage. Alderman Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Don't usually find any assessment of a proposal in 7 Mile Beach straightforward, and this fits that. And I think it's one of the issues with one of the complexities of this planning scheme. People rightly see what's written on page 57, clause 10.4.4A1, that around that 3% difference of the site coverage. And that's what's considered acceptable. People quite rightly go, well, this is unacceptable, which doesn't necessarily intuitively follow what then happens with, performance criteria, P1 of clause 4.4, 10.4.4 as follows, which lists on 58. I think it's a quirk because in some ways there is a degree of subjectivity. It's all meant to be linear in numbers, and then there's sort of this pool of subjectivity gets put in with, I guess, some of the planning officer's judgment. I reflected on it, did an overview of the site, etc. Whilst I kind of think they're right, I don't think there's an elegant way forward. So I am with some discomfort supporting the motion, although I wouldn't be entirely enjoying voting against it otherwise. It's awkward, and I guess that's why we exist in our role as members of the planning authority to try and find a way forward. But 7 Mile Beach is a complicated area, so I understand that this motion won't pass unanimous, and I'll respect the views of people that are voting one way or the other.
Thank you, Alderman Walker. Are there any other speakers? In that case, right to reply, Alderman Pearce.
Thank you, Mayor, and I do agree with what Alderman Walker said. I mean, this is a tough one. I mean, I remind you that the height of the building is 6 metres and could be 8.5, so they could have gone a lot higher. And as Alderman James said, and I'll read it out again, the proposed dwelling would be of a size and shape compatible with the regular shape of the lot. So, as I say, I think the officers have got it right, Mayor, and I ask people to support this motion.
Thank you. So the motion before the chair is approval, subject to conditions and advice for a dwelling at 64 Surf Road, 7 Mile Beach. All those in favour, please raise their electronic hand.
Thank you, Mayor. I have 6 votes at this point.
Okay, if you could clear the voting, and I'll ask when you have done for those against.
Pretty clear now, Mayor.
I have 6, so the motion is lost 6-all. Alderman Mulder.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
I'll take a seconder from Alderman Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As foreshadowed.
Sorry, I'll just confirm that.
I'm sorry, that was actually left up from the voting. You didn't clear the voting.
Okay, could I ask for a seconder, please?
Yes.
Alderman Kennedy, thank you. Alderman Mulder.
Mr Mayor, I will be brief. I've covered most of the perspectives in my previous contribution, so I'm moving an alternative motion for refusal for the reasons I previously indicated and for those that are contained within the alternative motion which was circulated. Mr Mayor, can I just add to the fact that the difficulty with this isn't so much retrofitting a difficult development into an area which was really never designed for the new planning scheme. But what we are doing in this is there's a consistent theme in here, which is using the non-complying premises that existed, and they are not, and there is no way we can retrofit or redesign the buildings or rebuild them to suit. But here we have a new development, and we are using the non-compliant retrofitted neighbours as an example, whereas the reality is that the new scheme came into effect on a certain date, and from that date, premises needed to conform to the scheme. And that's the reason that I think this motion, should get up, I believe that it will be appealed, and that appeal could get back to that negotiated settlement, which unfortunately the Land Use Planning Act forbids council from engaging in, or otherwise I'm sure we would have come to a mutually amicable settlement, but that's not our role.
Thank you. Alderman Kendi.
Nothing further from me, Mr Mayor.
Other speakers? Alderman Warren.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Look, having listened to the previous debate, I was also uncomfortable about this and unsure which way to vote, but I always try to get the best possible outcome. So if mediation would lead to an outcome that would be better for the neighbours, then I think it's worth trying for that.
Thank you. Alderman James.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I don't want to repeat what I mentioned in the early part of the debate, but it does, in fact, exceed the site coverage. And therefore that, by the very nature of where the building is going to be built, it would appear that there could have been some consultation to have it move some 2 metres forward. That would have still been in line with the other buildings along Surf Road. But at the same time, there wasn't consultation, nor was there, I suppose there was some expectation that there would be some discussion between the neighbours, but it didn't happen. And it would have achieved a positive result if that had happened. In fact, the location of the new building will be very, very close to the existing building on the block, and therefore the site of the building, the proposed building, could have been moved forward and therefore in line with the other buildings along Surf Road, and therefore given a bit more sort of area of, I suppose, parking for the existing building at the rear. So I support the recommendation that's for refusal, and I hope my colleagues support that.
Thank you. Alderman Ewington.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. I mean, look, if the proponent went out and built a single-storey building, he would exceed the site coverage again. So, I mean, you know, these guys have got to try and work with, you know, trying to keep as many people happy as possible. And I mean, to be only 3% over site coverage to try and maintain the setbacks to allow the privacy or more the shadowing, I don't know what much more people can do. I mean, look, 7 Mile Beach should be just as easy in any other area to deal with. We look at what the scheme says. The officers have gone through the reports. They've recommended approval. I mean, it's as simple as that. So as far as I'm concerned, I certainly won't be supporting this alternative motion.
Thank you. Do I have any other speakers? In that case, right a reply, Alderman Mulder.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just on the point that the site coverage is an objective criteria of 30%. It falls within the acceptable solution, as does some of the other issues that has been raised and that are in the motion. The bottom line is that the performance criteria are to be used to assess those applications that don't meet the acceptable solution. So even if the property were a single story, it would still occupy the same footprint. The point, though, is that the performance criteria would allow that, but if the building was sited, it would reduce the amenity or the impact on the amenity of neighbours. In that case, it would accord criteria, even though it would still not accord with the acceptable solutions. I know this is a little bit of a tricky area, but that's the nature of the new scheme. And this motion is all about finding a better assessment of the performance criteria to reduce the obvious impact of a two-storey building on a sub-minimal lot that doesn't meet the required setbacks. I encourage support.
Thank you. So the motion before the chair is a refusal for reasons outlined by Alderman Mulder. All those in favour of the refusal, please raise your electronic hand. Okay, I have 6. If we could clear, please, General Manager.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Just coming down now. Should be
All
clear.
those against, please raise your electronic hand. I have 6, so that motion is lost. What's the process from here, General Manager?
Thank you, Mayor. If Council is unable to resolve the decision, then it will revert to officers to do in accordance with our delegations.
Thank you. That's on the assumption that the proponent doesn't seek an extension, I take it. Doesn't grant an extension.
We would contact the proponent requesting an extension, and if that's not granted, then we will be obligated under our delegation to make a decision.
Thank you. Alderman Walker, you wanted to leave the meeting for the next motion?
Yeah, it's the best idea.
Item 6.3 is a development application at 228 Durant Avenue, Lindisfarne, for a change of use from residential to consulting rooms. Alderman Blomley, I take that as moving it. Seconded Alderman Newington. Alderman Blomley.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And
sorry. My timer is playing up. I'm sorry.
that's one way to gag debate.
Yeah, just bear with me for a moment. Thank you.
Certainly, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Please start again.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. And Mr. Mayor, I'd like to start by congratulating our officers for this thorough, considered and entirely professional report that we had before us this evening. I've had the opportunity to meet with proponents and also to visit the site. It's a site that would be well known to most of us, if not all of us, as it's directly opposite the very busy Lindisfarne commercial precinct, Lindisfarne Village shopping centre. We note that we're informed that 6 representations were received, and all those issues raised by the representatives have been dealt with very convincingly, in my view, by the officers in the report today. We know this area very well. The growing popularity of Lindisfarne Village, there will be minimal movements per day when one looks at the permitted use being sought under this DA, and there'll be no impact, no adverse impact on residents or businesses. This is council being savvy, being very smart, Mr. Mayor, in recognising the growing demands of our city. And it's for those reasons, Mr. Mayor, that I'm delighted to move the officer's recommendations.
Thank you. Alderman Newington.
Yeah, well, I agree with Alderman Blomley there. I mean, I think, that it's inevitable that area is going to expand from a commercial consulting business standpoint. You know, as we get increased density, there's going to be more people requiring services in that area, and I think this is you know, there's going to be a few teething problems and a few people concerned about that, but I think, you know, you've got to be realistic and accept that's inevitable. The only one comment I would like to make is that I note that the restrictions placed on the DA to say there's only one practitioner allowed in there, I think that's a little bit onerous, but I suppose it is what it is. We're faced with it at the moment, but I mean, you know, the traffic generated and, you know, be far greater in a lot of other houses that are being used as consulting rooms and the amount of traffic in the general area. So I just think, anyway, it was just my first observation. I thought that was a little bit harsh, but that might have been what they asked for. But anyway, I think it's a great, you know, addition to the community, an opportunity for a business to open and expand and provide services to the community. And I encourage my colleagues to support it.
Thank you, Alderman Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do feel a little uncomfortable with this. We previously had an application for an entirely different type of business on this location, and we refused that application and acknowledged the traffic problems. The driveway of this property is directly opposite, is it Franklin Street, the one that runs along the parking side of Woolworths. That's a very dangerous corner as it is. If there's one practitioner working in that building, that would suggest to me maybe 4 car movements an hour, adding to an already very busy street, and also very difficult to get parking for the existing businesses. So I'm not sure whether the traffic has been underestimated. I think that there is a danger here. I won't necessarily vote against it, but I think it's something that if this is successful, we will have to monitor very carefully.
Thank you, Alderman Warren. Other speakers? In that case...
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I'm trying to flag that's it. Thank you. Mr. Mayor, if we look at attachment 1 on the officer's report, you'll note that there is predominantly residential dwellings on that adjacent to the 228 Derwent Avenue, and the majority of those are in fact residential properties. There has been a block that has been subdivided some time ago, 232 and 232A, but nevertheless they are still residential with, I'm pretty sure, the 232A is in fact along with another residential dwelling at the rear. So in actual fact, what we have here is not only traffic movements into a business zone, into a predominantly residential area, but you're going to have a sort of set, in my opinion, precedent for other businesses to actually decide to move into that side of the street, and therefore it's going to create what I believe is a sort of a semi-commercial area on that northern aspect of the Derwent Avenue. So look, I agree that there was a proposal for a mobile food van, which we did not approve in the previous one of the council previous meetings, but nevertheless, I just don't feel comfortable in relation to why we need to sort of have a business encroaching into a predominantly residential area when immediately opposite you have commercial buildings, and that basically it takes into account everything between Wellington, Easterly, Franklin, and also almost not including Amelia Street, but that's a couple of blocks back. So it's better to, I think, have more of a development in a commercial area, business area, rather than encroach upon the actual residential area within Lindisfarne. I will not be supporting the recommendation.
Thank you, Alderman James. Other speakers? In that case, right to reply, Alderman Blomley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I thank colleagues for their contribution this evening. In regards to the traffic movements and the predicted number of vehicular movement. So that's covered off, of course, as we'd be aware, on page 82 of the report. But also, Mr Mayor, on 83 and 84 of the report, we're told that the proposed use will not involve an increase of activity on the site, which would be considered detrimental to the surrounding residential uses or out of character with the surrounding area. Alderman James, Mr Mayor, in his contribution, talked about this being a predominantly residential area. Well, we all know it's not, because even as he admitted, directly opposite is Woolworths shopping centre, is the bakery, is the liquor store. It's not a predominantly residential area at all. One side of the street has been, and we're told by our officers, our expert planning team, Mr Mayor, that the character of the area would remain intact as a residential neighbourhood. The proposed use is considered compatible with the surrounding uses. And that is why, Mr Mayor, it has, in my view, quite appropriately been recommended for approval, and I urge colleagues to do just that.
Thank you. So all those in favour, please vote accordingly. The recommendation is for approval, subject to conditions and advice.
I'm having trouble with my hand. There we go.
And all those, thank you, General Manager. I have 10 in favour.
Thank you. We're just writing them down at the moment, Mayor.
If we could just clear that, and all those against.
Okay.
Sorry, just clear it now.
And I have one against. So the motion is carried. Could we re-invite Alderman Walker, please?
Thank you, Mayor. I've sent a request to Alderman Walker, just to let you know when he's back in.
Thank you.
And Alderman Walker's back in.
Thank you. Item 6.4 is a development application at 2 Fort Street, Bellereve. Additions and alterations to a dwelling. Can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Alderman Richard James and Alderman Dean Ewington seconding it. Alderman James, would you like to speak to it?
Yes, Mr Mayor. Look, additions and alterations to the dwelling. There were two representations, but I think what the officers have clarified with respect to condition 2 is that it's including in the amended plan showing us wall of the upper deck enclosure in the southeast corner for a distance of 2.5 metres along the eastern and 2.8 along the southern elevation. And also the advice, the certificate of title contains several private covenants, and compliance with the covenants is the landowner's legal responsibility and may prevent or alter the ability to act upon this permit. But the planning authority, as you're aware, Mr Mayor, and my colleagues I think as well, that over the years there's been a lot of discussion in relation to what has been the builders at the time over the years have placed or put covenants on particular aspects of a building lot. But that is not a responsibility of the council as far as that's concerned, and what entails coming out of that is that it has to be basically sought out by the owners or the prospective buyers of the property in relation to that. But the officers have quite rightfully put that clause in there, or that paragraph in there as a basis, so that people are aware of what those covenants basically how they need to be addressed according to each circumstance in a particular development. So I support the recommendation, officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Alderman Newington.
No, pretty straightforward, Mr Mayor. I think it's a pretty easy one. I encourage everyone to support it.
Yeah. Other speakers? In that case, there's no need for a right of reply, so the recommendation is for approval, subject to conditions of advice. All those in favour, please raise your hands. I've got 2 physical, and I have the only one I haven't seen at this stage is Alderman Warren. Okay, we have lower those. Alderman Warren, I take it you're in favour. Thank you. The motion is carried unanimously. Moving on to item 6.5, it's a recommended for refusal, a development application 23 and 25 Hill Street, Bellereve for 3 multiple dwellings. Could I have a mover and a seconder for the officer's recommendation, please? Alderman James. Do I have a seconder? Alderman Walker, thank you. Alderman James.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The reasons that the officers have spelt out on page 112 of the council agenda is quite clear in as much as the proposal does not comply with clause 10.4.2p3, as the development will cause a loss of sole access to habitable room windows in the private open space of adjoining properties, which would result in a loss of amenity. And also the proposal does not comply as the development would cause unreasonable impact on residential amenity of neighbouring properties due to the loss of privacy and overlooking. These are really important aspects within the planning scheme, and the officers in their deliberations have gone through in great detail, as per the officer's report, to spell out the impact that these particular clauses, 10.4.2 and 10.4.6, are at the crux of what a development really ought to be able to address. And if it doesn't, therefore, that is contrary to the planning scheme. And in this particular case, it does not add up, and therefore the officers have recommended for refusal. This is really an important part of where we look at amenity versus, and also too about solar access to habitable room. We've had a number of these over the years, and there has been a number of these particular proposals that have gone to appeal, and in a couple of instances that it has been upheld because of the nature that there was not sufficient solar access to a habitable room, and also there was an unreasonable impact on the residential amenity of the neighbouring properties. So I seek council support.
Thank you. Alderman Walker.
Yeah, look, I don't know that this was that far away from approval, and I do understand that there had been a fair bit of tic-tacking over time between the applicants and indeed the officers. I don't have a lot of joy in seconding the refusal. The refusal is what was in the report. You've got to read through those closely, and you've got to weigh things up. I don't think the threshold is met for a counter motion. I think there are things that need to be worked through. I'm really hopeful that this is the sort of thing that could possibly be advanced through a mediation process. But I think the mediation process has got to start on the basis of where the officers actually ended up in this case. Sometimes there's a lot to weigh up, and it does override. We often operate in the nebulous of subjectivity, or close things one way or the other. And going into this realm, there wasn't enough for me to be looking the other way. So I think the prudent thing to do is to, having read the report, follow the recommendations. And I'm hopeful, looking at what was put to us today in the email from the representatives, if you like, the applicants, I'm hopeful that through mediation, a result that's acceptable to all can be achieved.
Thank you. Alderman Mulder.
Sorry, Mr Mayor, I don't.
You've muted on us.
Mr Mayor, I was planning to maybe speak later in the debate, and I don't know why my hand is raised. I think it was just not lowered after the last vote.
Okay, noted. Alderman Blomley.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And as I expressed at our briefing on Friday, I'm very uncomfortable with this recommendation, and I won't be supporting it. And as we know from correspondence that Alderman Walker referenced a moment ago and that we've all received, there's been more than 12 months of interaction and collaboration between the proponents, the applicants rather, and our planning team. Sure, 3 representations were received, but when we're talking about lack of solar access, as referenced by Alderman James, and as seemed to be the sole negative contained within the report at the loss of sunlight to the unit at 28 Stanley Street. When you go to the site, Mr Mayor, or even if you just open your email from the applicant and look at the photographs there of the trees and the shade cloth that are already in place, yeah, I sort of question how much sunlight there is already reaching that property, let alone at the winter solstice, at that one day of the year, that magical day of the year that everything seems to turn on. So I am extraordinarily disappointed that after, as I say, more than 12 months of interaction, where we've landed in this place where we're being advised by planning staff to refuse this development. I would hope that there's another way forward. I think it is a sound development, and I think that we should be looking at more of these types of developments in our city. And we, as a council, should be saying, how can we make this happen? Obviously within the confines of a planning scheme, but what's possible? And I think this is possible. I think it's doable. And if we're all going to sort of hang our hats on possible potential mediation outcomes, that's not a good message to send to people who want to invest in our city. So, Mr Mayor, for those reasons, I certainly will not be supporting this motion before us this evening.
Thank you, Alderman Edmonds.
Thanks very much. Really briefly from me, just to sort of reiterate what Alderman Walker said. I'm really sympathetic to the proponent, and going over their correspondence and reading the report. But at the end of the day, it's not compliant enough, unfortunately, for me to go from refusal to approval in its current form, regrettably. Thanks.
Thank you, Alderman Ewington.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Look, the bottom line with this one is, I mean, look, I've got no doubt that the planning staff have interpreted the scheme appropriately in terms of their knowledge and skill. What it comes down to is the problem we have where we are moving towards infill housing in a lot of our residential areas, which means that we're going to have more two-storey houses, more shadowing, more potential for these sort of things to occur. Now, I think that's going to be an issue for the state. I'm going to come up with a planning scheme that allows these sort of things to be managed a little bit easier. Because I mean, if you live on the bottom side of the local topography of the land can make huge impacts on whether you get shadowing onto your property. And if you buy on the bottom side of a hill, well, that's going to mean that can happen. And I don't know whether necessarily in this case we've sort of taken that into account. And as someone who's grew up in Waverley Street, which similar sort of orientation to this property here, in the middle of winter, you don't get any sun at all. Basically, the sun tracks around behind you and you get no sun at all. So sometimes the local conditions mean that things are knocked back, not necessarily because they're any different than any other development that we've seen in the city, just because of the specifics of the location. And I think some way to take account of those variabilities and also take into account the need to have this infill housing would give a little bit of clarity to people trying to do this sort of stuff. Like I said, I certainly don't. The planning staff have done their job, but I certainly feel for the proponents in this situation. And in slight changes, it would have been all okay. I mean, I'd like to think, as a group, we could have considered refusing it, but I encourage the proponents to look at all options to try and mediate if they have to. But certainly, I can't see any real problem with the development myself. So I won't be supporting the refusal, but hopefully they find a way to make it happen.
Thank you, Alderman Warren.
Mr. Mayor, look, I also think that this has the potential to be a good development, but it's not quite there yet. Again, let's look for the best outcome where we can address the problems, which I think have been clearly identified by our planners, and it's just a matter of having that final discussion and making those adjustments so that it does comply and everyone can be happy.
Thank you. Alderman Mulder.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think I'd like to compliment our expert planning officers on, once again, an excellent report. And as they will tell you time and time again, using the performance criteria is a very rubbery issue. Here, unlike the previous development, there is actual objective standards in relation to a loss of solar access. And solar access has also got a lot to do, I would suspect, with things like renewable energy. But anyway, the other reason the proposal doesn't comply is because it impacts upon the residential amenity of neighbouring properties due to a loss of privacy and overlooking. Now, I understand that this has been in the process of negotiation with council staff for the last 12 months. And I'm just wondering whether during all those negotiations, this solution that we think we may get was actually put to the developers, and that they haven't been prepared to move far enough to address these two particular concerns. So I'm very comfortable with us going into this process. I'm very comfortable with it being appealed, and I'm also very comfortable with whatever outcome the appeals tribunal. But we've got to say here that the officers have done the best in terms of negotiating, apparently, with the proponent, and in terms of using the performance criteria to assess its non-compliance with acceptable solutions.
Thank you. Alderman Chong.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, I certainly, like others, have sympathy with the developer, and I do appreciate the fact that they've done a lot of work with our planners over the past year. Like others, for me, I need to support the officer's recommendation. I don't think it quite reaches the barrier of being able to go against that recommendation at the moment. I am concerned about the lack of solar access, as everyone would be, and I hope that when it will, as it presumably does, go to mediation, that an acceptable solution can be found.
Thank you. No other speakers. Call on Alderman James for Alderman Pearce. You're muted, Alderman Pearce.
I know.
You're off. You're on now.
I'm on. I'm on. Good, good. I don't know what happened there. No idea what happened. I couldn't get off mute. Look, I think Alderman Chong summed it.
You're gone again, John. Alderman Pearce.
You've muted yourself again. You're on now.
Am I on?
You're on now.
Yep. Tells me I'm muted. So I have no idea what's going on.
Well, feel confident to speak. You're open to the world there, Alderman Pearce.
Right. I agree with what Alderman Chong just said, and even though I'd love to see this go ahead and I'd love to support it, but I've refused things because of solar access before, so I'd rather be hypocritical to vote for it, but I think it will go to mediation, and I think we will have a development there at some stage. And like Alderman Blomley said, this has been going on for 12 months. I'm surprised that there could have been no solution found in that time. I'm really disappointed in that. So, but hopefully it'll be a positive outcome. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Alderman James. Right, a reply.
I'll just sum up in the officer's comments on page 121 that the application has not demonstrated that it complies with the requirements of the scheme. I seek council support.
Thank you. So all of those in favour of the refusal, please raise your hand. Thank you, General Manager. That's 10.
Hand up? Is my hand up or not?
Yes.
All right.
So if you could lower the hands, please, GM.
Coming down now.
And those against, please raise your hand. So the motion is carried, sorry, 10-2. And that concludes our business as a planning authority. Moving through the next item on the agenda, requiring action, motions on notice. 8.1, Alderman Walker.
Yes, I want to move the motion as listed against my name for in the agenda.
Do I have a seconder, please? So, Alderman Kennedy, thank you. Alderman Walker, please continue.
All right. Look, if Clarence meetings had a bingo card, then I expect from me rule of law and property rights are phrases that I intend to try and get in at every meeting. And to those that say this runs counter to the principle of property rights, I say in the context of dereliction, along with property rights comes property responsibilities. In most instances, we're currently effectively powerless other than to launch, I guess we could launch the nuclear option of compulsory acquisition when these things acquire, but that's crazily heavily handed and I wouldn't support it. But we're effectively powerless when we're dealing with properties that are in a bad way for a long period of time. There needs to be a way forward, and a derelict register and levy might not be a perfect approach, but it is much better than the lack of effective remedies that we have now. And there are properties that do fit this currently. I can think along Clarence Street, some that have been in a state of dilapidation now for years. And I don't think I'm the only alderman. In fact, I'm sure I'm not the only alderman that's been contacted by civic-minded residents about such properties and being powerless to do anything about their concerns, which I share, as I do their frustrations. And I feel this motion will empower people in that situation and again, advance things within our community. Whilst you can't legislate outcomes, you can introduce incentives. And this motion is the anti-dereliction incentive the community deserves. I consider this motion pro-business. Do you think customers are more or less likely to use a business operated next to a boarded up, graffitied property? It's also about the optimal usage of land. An abandoned service station site is a magnet for vandalism, but it could easily be repurposed into a location for food vans. The motion is inspired by the Derelict Site Act 1990 from the Republic of Ireland, and that defines a derelict site as any land that detracts or is likely to detract to a material degree from the amenity, character and appearance of land in the neighbourhood of the land in question because of structures which are ruinous, derelict or in dangerous condition, or neglected, unsightly or objectionable condition of the land or of structures on it, or the present deposit or collection of litter, rubbish, debris or waste. In Ireland, the property registers, if you like, are run by each local authority or council. And if a property is listed on the register, it contains the location of the derelict site, the name and address of the owner, the details of any action undertaken by council, and the current market value. And this helps communities and councils keep track of these sort of properties in the area, and it's a resource for people who might have an idea for a more productive use. And if you like, it's a safeguard for people that are potentially looking at buying the sites as well. Properties entered into the register are required to pay the council dereliction levy as well. And whilst the number of properties that fit this in Clarence, as I said, is presently small, it can have a big impact. And we are living in peculiar times. Borrowing money is now at record lows, and you can't quantitatively ease land. It's finite. And value changes over the last 12 months would attest that land banking can be economically rational. The problem is with things like an absentee landlord, they're less likely to be fussed about the state of such a property because it doesn't affect their day-to-day life. It's not the amenity of the area where they live, where they shop, or where they recreate. And I don't think dereliction should be normalised or accepted. I think owners who let properties slide into dereliction are being antisocial. It's an act of civic vandalism. And like all vandalism, penalties should apply. Derelict properties degrade from the amenity and feeling of safety. They also are, again, not conducive to supporting economic activity. I'm just going to round this up by the simple fact that this motion is about the principle of the register, getting council to support the principle, and it'll be a long way through, if you like, before we get to the end product. There's workshops and other things to go, and I think this is the first step in raising an issue which local government fails to have the tools to address, and I seek your support.
Thank you. Alderman Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I can only see positives in everything Alderman Walker has outlined, and I look forward to us workshopping through this, because what a useful register this would be. Thank you.
Thank you. Alderman Edmonds.
Thank you. Yeah, what a great motion, and I won't add to what was said because it was put so well. Other than to say, like, this has actually found a solution to an issue that people raise with us, where you almost shrug your shoulders. It's a real head scratcher for us about how to solve these issues when they're raised, because you know how much can we intervene. Hopefully this is as much carrot as stick, and I think that the General Manager's comments really sum up why I'll be enthusiastically voting in support tonight, and congratulate the mover.
Thank you. Alderman Chong.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I couldn't tell you how many times over the years I've had complaints about the particular derelict building in Richmond, and the frustration that I and the neighbours feel about the fact that we have no capacity to do anything about it other than make sure there was a fence around it to make sure it wasn't dangerous. So I think this is a great first step. I understand Alderman Walker's comments. This will take time, but I think this is a great place to start, and I will be enthusiastically supporting the motion.
Thank you. Alderman James.
I have some concerns with the motion, and I did mention at the briefing on Friday that it's council waving the big stick, not necessarily a pro-business approach, but it's the lowest common denominator within the city. In other words, it's going straight to the person or persons who, through no fault of their own, are unable to obviously build a particular dwelling or have some reason, family reasons. There may be some case where there is a conflict within an estate, and this may be one of the factors that may mean that that particular building cannot be constructed. What this motion is doing, it is basically putting a black mark against any person, whether it's a residential, an individual within a particular area, and having them put on a black list as saying you are now recorded on this list, and therefore it is available, the register is available for all and sundry to be able to identify and notice that that particular person is, for some reason or another, is responsible for a dilapidated, derelict or abandoned properties. It is striking at the heart of what we believe is the decency that we should afford to anybody in particular circumstances, because through no fault of their own, they may be in circumstances which they are unable to proceed, and therefore they are unable to provide or construct the particular building. Also, on top of that, you want to charge them a fee. There's going to be an option for establishing a charge applied to buildings placed upon the dilapidated, derelict and abandoned building register. It's council waving the big stick over people who I believe, through no fault of their own. There are people that obviously have had this, tried to play the game, and we know a couple of instances in Richmond and also in Clarence Street where progress on these buildings has not proceeded, and they have been able to gain extensions and under the circumstances for good reasons or other. But the fact of the matter is, if this particular motion gets up, it's going to blacklist people through no fault of their own, and therefore they are also going to have to be required to pay a fee, a levy, a rate to the building placed upon that particular on that building register. I said on Friday at our meeting that I would support that the local government part C of the motion lobby the state government to investigate a legislative mechanism enabling statewide, publicly available dilapidated, derelict and abandoned buildings, registers and a charge of levies. That's across the board. But why are we in Clarence striking and putting a black mark against people who, through no fault of their own, in the circumstances that are available to them, will be listed, and public at large can able to go in and look at that register and therefore decide and know perhaps the circumstances that they may believe are inappropriate, but nevertheless they are still being blacklisted and recorded on the register. I will not support this. This is cutting at everything I've believed in over the years in this council, that there is a mechanism to be able to get these sort of situations done, and Part C would be a good way to proceed with it. But to have this motion locked in at A, B and C, I will not support it.
Thank you, Alderman Von Berto.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Mr Mayor, I agree with Alderman James, and I'd also like to bring the Alderman's attention to the fact that there is currently, under the Building Act 2016 at sections 241 and 242, a discretionary process for the general manager, to be able to look at the aspect of dilapidated buildings. Within the Building Act 2016 at section 4, the meaning of dilapidated building is detailed. And then within the sections, there is also a process that's detailed by the Director's Guideline Dilapidated Buildings from the Consumer Building and Occupational Services Department within the Department of Justice. And that very briefly entails that if a general manager becomes aware of a potentially dilapidated building, then the general manager can determine whether it is in fact a dilapidated building by inspecting the premises, preparing a report and detailing what building works need to be done. The issue of the building notice can then occur in terms of the premises to the owner, and then the owner has a right to respond within 14 days. There's also the ability for the general manager to then revoke that notice. There's also the ability for the owner to appeal to what is now the Tasmanian Civil and Administrative Tribunal. So there is actually a process in place to deal with dilapidated buildings at this point in time. It's not, if you like, a public process. It is a process that is used to interact with the owner. So we have that process already, and I believe that we need to use that process rather than the one that is being suggested by Alderman Walker. Let's use what we've got already. I would imagine that if the general manager became aware of such a property, and it's being detailed that there are a number of those properties, if they can be brought to our attention, he can liaise with us in terms of whether or not to start that process. So let's do that rather than what is being suggested. Thank you.
Thank you, Alderman von Berto. Alderman Warren.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And thank you to Alderman von Berto for raising those interesting points about the dilapidated building clauses in the Building Act of 2016. As Alderman von Berto is probably aware, I was involved in the drafting of that legislation, so it's reasonably familiar to me, although that was some time ago. But my understanding is that the intent of that is to address buildings that have fallen into disrepair, as opposed to buildings that are safe but have not been completed and are an eyesore, which is, I believe, the intent of this this motion. And I do applaud Alderman Walker for bringing this motion to us, because on Saturday morning, yet again, I had a friend say to me, when are you going to do something about that building on the corner of we know where? And I was, for once, I was able to say we're looking at doing something, whereas usually I just have to say there's nothing we can do. So I think that this is a positive first step. I was driving around the municipality over the weekend and I must have gone past at least 4 sites that have been, they wouldn't fall under the dilapidated buildings. Some of them are just empty and weed covered, as Alderman Walker mentioned, old service stations. And I'm sure some of my colleagues would agree with me when I say, well, these would be great places to do some infill social housing, some, medium density housing developments. They're reasonable sized blocks and you could fit a dozen dwellings on there and address some of our housing crisis. But at the moment we're stuck. These have been empty and uncared for, weed grown, graffitied for longer than I've been in council. So I do applaud this motion. As Alderman Walker says, it's a first step. We wouldn't be making any agreements about levies, etc. tonight. That would be through the normal workshop process where we have a chance to look at this in more detail. But we need some way of addressing buildings that are incomplete but have a valid permit, which I understand is the one on the corner, and I don't believe that falls under the building legislation dilapidated buildings clause, and building sites that are empty and unloved, which certainly don't fall under the dilapidated building. So I do commend this motion to my colleagues.
Thank you, Alderman Mulder.
Thank you to Alderman von Berto for her description of the law, but I guess whether she is right or whether Alderman Warren is right would really depend upon the second reading speeches, the intent of the legislation. I have some concerns with the idea that we're going to describe sites that are simply unused as now derelict. That is a bit of a concern because there's commercial reality and there are circumstances that prevent these buildings from being used. Now, the service station site in Clarence Street is certainly not, falling into disrepair or anything like that. Its windows were boarded up and people attacked it with graffiti. Well, sorry, that's the nature of life, and as though it might be untidy. We have the situation where that's not the only site. How long? It had to be about 7 years that the K&D site at Cambridge Park was basically empty because the commercial reality was we were unable to, the owners were unable to secure a tenant. So there it sat, empty, a target for graffiti, and there had been some graffiti attacks on it. They were cleaned up, of course. Then you have the situation where perhaps a developer has started a development. It's become commercially unviable, and therefore no one is going to force someone to complete a building which is commercially unviable. There are all sorts of issues about, well, should it be taken down? And that may be a case. But then you have other buildings where, you know, the proponent has died during construction, and the thing is tangled up in a messy 4, 5, and who knows how long probate issues go. And you know, and we can have a register, but then what do we do with that register? We can talk about levies and other things like that, and we can talk about appeal mechanisms and go through the court, and we all know how long that can take. But what's the objective of all of this? You know, the objective can't be to force someone to do with their land something they don't want to do. It can't force us to take down a building that is otherwise safe and not a danger to many persons. You know, land banking is something that happens, but the new planning scheme gives us a bit of light at the tunnel. The local planning provisions in the commercial zone, as we saw in Yachtsman's Way, actually allow these buildings to become exactly what Alderman Warren was talking about: high density housing built on commercial sites. And all we need is a pretense of some commercial operation somewhere in the building, and bingo, because it's becoming increasingly obvious that the only really commercially viable developments in this city are going to be residential housing for some time to come.
Thank you, Alderman Pearce.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor, I like the recommendation, except I do think that Part C is probably a bit premature, because I'd like to see Part B get worked on and brought back to us for one or many workshops before we actually say we adopt it or then we lobby the state government. I just think it's going to take a while. And I mean, I find it rather confronting because I don't know yet till we do it. If I've got a dilapidated property, how long have I got to fix it up? These are questions that, you know, I really need to know the answer of. And I may be considering selling my property, and all of a sudden you say it's dilapidated. Well, that doesn't do me much good if I'm trying to sell the thing. So there's a lot of questions here that I really need answering. I'll support the motion, but I'm not really happy with Part C. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no other speakers, right a reply, Alderman Walker.
Look, thank you, everybody, for your contributions. Again, I want to really emphasise this is about the principle of the register, and it's the start of a process, and you're not voting on something that's getting enacted tomorrow. You're basically voting to say this is something worth having a discussion about, and starting with us. I say it time and time again, we are all different councils and different state governments are laboratories of democracy. Here's a problem. Here's a way forward. We'll be talking it through, trying to see where it gets to. And there'll be plenty of safeguards before this thing came out. But I think Alderman Warren addressed some of the shortcomings of the current scheme. You know, I will say one thing about our general manager. You know, he knows laws inside and out, and he would have used whatever powder and shot was within the tools of him to address some of these long-standing properties, and it couldn't be done. The idea that everything is okay and we have the ways to deal with these problems is just false. It is demonstrably false by a drive around this city. So again, all you're committing to is the principle and to start a workshop process. It's a sequential process, so I understand where Alderman Pearce's discomfort is, but again, that all goes through the process of where we get to with the workshop. So there's a long way to go yet. And in fact, you know, it is a topic that has been raised at LGAT before. There've been motions by other councils sort of around 10 years ago, looking at, you know, they wanted to compulsorily acquire such properties. Now, I don't think that's the way forward. What I think this does is, if you like, it facilitates a discussion with you know, property owners that are in these serious states. We're not talking about a bit of an overgrown verge, you know, or a fence that's slightly on a tilt. This is a serious level of threshold before the intervention comes, and there are ways forward. There are ways to have a partially completed site that are not like putting a middle finger up to the rest of the community when they go past and transact their business. And again, I appreciate the rhetorical flourishes as well. That's part of what this process is. And to the unpersuadable, I respect your your right to vote against it. But it is effectively going on record to say that everything's fine, and it's not. So look, I seek your support because you're supporting the community. This is not something that's pulled out of the ether. As I say, this is what's used in the Republic of Ireland, and we can learn from it, and we start the process, and we see where the General Manager has as we enter the discussions, and let's see if we can make it happen. If not, we've at least had the discussion and tried to find a way forward to a problem that the community find as real and tangible every time they go down certain streets. Seek your support.
Thank you. All those in favour of Alder Walker's motion, please raise your hands. Okay, I have 10. General Manager, if you can lower all the hands, please. And all those against? 2 against. So the motion is carried. Alderman Mulder, item 8.2.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My motion simply proposes that currently, when we have a tied vote or council doesn't actually reach a majority decision one way or another, that currently, as the General Manager explained, we now need to go back to the proponent and seek an extension of time, which invariably is not granted, and therefore the officer's recommendation, they're delegated to the General Manager, who may or may not.
Alderman Mulder, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I didn't pick up a seconder.
Let's see. I'll second the motion.
Thank you, Alderman James. Alderman Mulder, please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And what we do now is we go back to the developer and say, please grant an extension of time, which invariably they do not, because we all know that you can grant an extension of time, but the vote is unlikely to change. Now, it's the same as when there's 6-6 or when a recommendation goes up and fails, but an alternative isn't proposed or done on the night. So we revert back to this motion will simply take out that second step of asking the nonsense question to the proponent as to whether he wants us to grant more time to come up with the unlikely different result. There's plenty of time for consultation and assessment and debate during the public consultation period of these matters that come before us. And this is a simple attempt to streamline it so that there is some surety and that we don't have to do what we previously did, which was if we tied 6-6, then someone would have to resubmit the officer's recommendation or the first motion, and someone would have to take one for the team to avoid a complicated and expensive resolution. This delegation speeds things up. It is a sensible, logical approach, and it will simply give the public some more assurance about what occurs once council has made or failed to make a decision. I commend the motion.
Thank you, Alderman James.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, I second the motion because I believe that Alderman Mulder ought to have his day in the forum, so to speak. But it can just take as an example this evening when the motion was 6-all. That's when the motion was put, and then it was 6-all, and then the contrary motion was put, and that was 6-all. What happens if this motion is lost? Then the General Manager will approach the applicant and seek an extension of time. The applicant may say, yes, I would like the Alderman to consider this, and may grant an extension of time. Otherwise, he or she may say, no, I do not, and therefore the officers would have to exercise their delegation. Alderman Mulder's motion is taking out that second step in the process. That is approaching the applicant and seeking an extension of time. It can work in favour of the council, the elected reps, and it can, and also it cannot, because it depends on what the officer's recommendation was in the first instance. It's important, I think, to at least have that safeguard in place, because there is that option that the applicant will say yes and would give an extension of time, and during that time, the extension, there can be the parties that may come together. The applicant may approach the alderman and say, well, look, I decided to provide an extension of time because I believe that the alderman ought to make a decision in relation to this as part of the planning authority. So look, it's going to streamline. Alderman Mulder's motion gets up, it will streamline, but it'll take away that opportunity for the council to actually have a deliberation again and also support it. So look, let's leave it as it is. Okay, it does throw a spanner in the works, but then again, let's give the applicant the benefit of the doubt, and therefore I think that if we do that, then in fact there is that safety valve in the process which will enable us to also perhaps have another go at this, and it can be worked through, and at the end of the day we could come to a compromise and an arrangement which may suit the council and also the applicant. I do not support the motion, and I speak against it for the reasons that I believe that we ought to be given that second opportunity to be able to decide on an issue on any particular development application as the planning authority.
Thank you, Alderman James. Could I ask the Deputy Mayor to briefly take the chair?
Certainly. Alderman Edmonds, you are next.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Look, I think for me, the explanatory notes is what sums us up. You know, that point 2 talks about where council has been unable to make a decision on planning item, proponents in the community being left unclear as to what happens next. And then point 3, obviously, because this isn't on the screen, I'll just read that out quickly as well. The new delegation will give certainty in terms of process and decision making. Also noting the GM's comments. For me, it's about the certainty. We've had decisions where we don't know what the next step is, and we've also had rules that we sort of weren't sure where they came from in some cases. So look, it's got my support for those reasons. I won't take up any more time.
Thank you, Alderman Edmonds. Alderman Ewington.
Thank you, unless the Mayor wants to go before me.
No, I think he stepped out.
Oh, I stepped out. Okay, fine. Okay. Look, there's two sides to this. I mean, look, I see that on one hand it might provide certainty, but it also, Alderman James's comments sort of hit the nail on the head too there, where it does give, you know, if it's a recommended for a approval and we vote 6-all, yeah, it's going to go straight through, and they're going to say, yeah, no extension, and then if it's recommended for approval by the staff, well, that'll be the authority will pass on to them, and they'll more likely say, well, we've approved it. But if it's a refusal, the proponent may want to consider the option of you know, minor amendments or negotiation or extension of time to allow them to get through. And being someone who you know, is pro council doing whatever it can to help people to make things happen, I think I'd prefer to have a situation stay as it is, where, you know, the option is left with the proponent rather than taken out of their hands. So I'd suggest that, you know, it's a very minor change. It might provide certainty in one way, but I think on the other hand, the person making the application should be given the most flexibility to be able to try and make their proposal come to fruition. And I think this is what will maintain it best, by having the ability to authorise an extension of time. So I won't be supporting this motion.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor, and thank you, Alderman Newington. Are there any other speakers? Alderman Walker.
I hope there's a lot of other speakers because I'm in a bit of an undecided state here. Previously, a 6-all vote was an undecided vote. It was the gates to chaos for a planning authority to not come up with a decision. It was the gates to mountains of riches for legal representatives on both sides. Now, that risk has been mitigated, but at the cost of that, perhaps you could say, has been an abrogation of our responsibilities. When those situations came up, we were probably, all of us over our career had one point in time where we had to be the swing person, where we had to make an unpalatable decision and find a way through. I guess one of the things that happens now is it's almost, it does outsource the process to the officers, including all the steps around negotiation. I guess what's favourable about this motion is we will own the decision on the night. The representatives for something and against will have I'll be under no illusion of where things go forward. There'll probably be an auto statement that the Mayor says at each point, which is this motion will now be proceeded forward, delegated by the planning officers in line with their recommendations. There'll be no uncertainty around that, and in some ways, in a constrained planning environment, then there's probably some benefit to that. There's certainly some probably efficiency gains to that. It does snuff out, if you like, that one way forward where the owner could see that all they needed to do was move the fence by 5 centimetres and the whole thing goes away, and maybe that happens. So I am undecided about it. I am slightly persuaded by the fact that it'll be simpler and put less of the, and put the dilemma, if you like, on us. So please, other people speak and persuade me one way or the other.
I don't have any other speakers. Right, a reply, Alderman Mulder. You're muted, Alderman Mulder.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple of points. The first one is, and if you look at the wording of the first reason, the current two-step process utilises a delegation in a way that was not originally contemplated when the delegation was originally approved. Now, these are not my words. I will thank the General Manager because they were his words. Now, if we've got a delegation being used in a way that was not contemplated, it is open seriously to question about whether it is a proper delegation. And if people thought the process was appropriate, then we should have had the delegation amended to be specific about this. Now, the other issues were, related to if it's refusal, and this gives an opportunity for the developer to maybe lobby some of the aldermen to change their mind. Well, there's been plenty of that opportunity in the port, and I would be pushing to find circumstances where a refusal would be any different. In terms of whether this gives someone an opportunity to move the fence, that, as our planning people will tell us, is actually a different application. And we are not in a position to debate different applications. If the developer has a refusal and it turns out that all he has to do is move a fence, or as we saw tonight, has to move a building on the plan while he still can, then that is technically a separate application, unless it ends up in the planning tribunal where it is a mediated outcome. Now, where these changes occur under our system is in that mediation phase. So all we're doing with this two-step process, which, and I hesitate to use, is an inappropriate delegation or an appropriate use of an original delegation. And what we're doing is we're just bringing it in to the reality of the process that we have without the fiction and without improperly using a delegation. Now, it beholds upon council that if they think this is that the current two-step process is appropriate, then then someone needs to come back to council and tidy up the existing delegation, because it is as inappropriate.
Thank you, Alderman Mulder. So all those in favour of Alderman Mulder's motion, would you please raise your hand? I have 5.
I don't have Alderman Mulder's vote there, Mayor. I would assume he was voting in favour of his motion. There it is.
Are we missing any others? In that case, I have 6-4. Could you lower the hands and we'll re-vote on those that are opposed?
All hands are lowered, Mayor.
Thank you. So those opposed to the motion, please raise your hands. I have 4 against and take it as 2 abstentions, which means the motion is lost.
Just to be clear, I was voting against mine. It wasn't working though. So I'm voting against it.
Okay, so
not abstaining.
Right.
Okay,
I have you again. Yeah, 5 with 1 abstention then. Thank you, Alderman Blomley. Noted. And with that, I declare the motion is lost. And move to item 9, which is Alderman's question time.
Mr. Mayor, was that 6-6 lost, just out of curiosity?
6-5 abstain, and an abstention counts as a nay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can I ask that the be delegated to the General Manager for decisions? That I'll be requesting for an extension of time.
I think you've lost that one.
Good try, Alderman.
In that case, can we move to item 9, Alderman's question time? There are no matters on notice. Answers to questions raised at the last council meeting are in the agenda, and we'll take those as read. Moving to questions without notice, could I start with you, Alderman Warren, please?
Nothing from me, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, Alderman Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, our first question is in relation to a notice of motion that I moved, I think from memory, in November, around inclusion of a representative from a, if you like, dog walking group onto the Tracks and Trails Committee. My understanding is that it was going to take some constitutional tweaking, but can I have a rough idea on the likely timelines of when this might occur, or if there's been correspondence with representative groups since that motion?
GM, who'd be in the best position to answer that, or take it on notice?
Mr. Tui might be able to answer it, but we'll probably need to take that one on notice, man.
Okay, so be it. Did you have a second question, Alderman Walker?
Yeah, look, this one might have to go on notice. There's been some issues in Cremorne, sort of around about the I guess you call it the 80s of Pipe Clay Esplanade, where you know, the road isn't specifically sealed, and it relates to problems, I think, that conduit, you know, or cables gets exposed. So My question is, can officers have another look at that area? Because I understand something was rectified by contractors at the end of January, and see whether we need to be more specific in some of the protections of this, or what role council actually has to do.
I think we will take that on notice. Thanks, Alderman Walker. Alderman Von Berto.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In the Alderman's weekly briefing package, week commencing 20th of September 2021, Aldermen were advised via a memo from the Group Manager Engineering Services, Mr. Graham, dated the 21st of September 2021, that there had been water damage to the Alma's Activity Centre flooring. Could we be provided with a detailed reason for the damage, the cost of the repairs, whether the full cost will be covered by insurance, and the status of the repairs?
Certainly, and clearly that one will have to be taken on notice. But if GM, if we could have a briefing on that in the weekly briefing report when available.
Through you, Mayor. Alderman Von Berto did send that question to us earlier this afternoon. I think Mr. Graham may have an answer prepared.
Okay.
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor. So there was a leak from a water main in a hand basin, which caused water damage to parquetry and carpet in the main reception and adjoining rooms, which required entire replacement of those said areas. The damage is about $111,000. It is covered by insurance, and at present the works are 95% complete.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for the heads up, Alderman Von Berto. Did you have a second question?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, Alderman Pearce.
Thank you, Mayor. We got a letter from the Minister regarding ferries. When are we going to receive some more information? I noticed the government want us to put money in for facilities and whatever. When are we going to receive some more information on ferries in general?
GM, are you able to help us there?
Mr. Pask may well be able to provide some update. We've certainly been in contact looking for some additional user numbers and so forth, but Mr. Pask might have those details.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we'll have an update for Alderman on the specifics of the ferry as it related to the Ashes service that we recently assisted with, and more broadly ferries and sort of the greater transport network will be considered as part of the Metro Plan consultation in the next couple of months.
Yeah, I think the nub of Alderman Pear's question essential. We've had some rhetoric from government, indeed from our sister council at the other side of the river, about trials being extended, and we've got nothing definitive in terms of whether there's any expectations or not on this council contributing towards those extensions. So I guess what we're really seeking is whether there's any guidance available or any progress to getting guidance on the future of all that.
Thank you, Mayor. I think the short answer to that is not at this stage. We're pretty much in the same position as officers as the elected members are. That there's been some announcements about the possible way forward, but certainly no details at this point.
Okay.
Thank you for that. Mayor, second question. Some time ago, the Beltana Bowls Club wrote in about their car park needs some attention, and looking at it, it looks like there's been a pipe or wires put under the ground, and I have no idea whose responsibility that is. I'm just wondering, because they sent a letter in, I think, before Christmas, can we just get someone to go and have a look at their car park and just see what needs to be done and see if it's council's or their responsibility? Thank you.
GM?
I'm not aware of that unless Mr. Graham is, Mayor.
Through Mr. Mayor, I'm not aware of that, but I'll certainly take it on notice and advise Alderman after I've found the information.
Thank you. Alderman Mulder.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have two questions. The first one was prompted by the very good question from Alderman Pearce, and it relates to the ferry trial. When will we get a full report on against the key performance criteria or whatever objectives the government had set for the ferry trial? I'm not talking about just the usage, but the impact on the traffic congestion on the Tasman Bridge, which was one of the reasons for the trial, one of the performance for the trial.
GM, are you able to help us there?
Thank you, Mayor. I will have to take that one on notice. I'll need to follow that up with the Department of State Growth.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My second question relates to my failed motion this evening. Given the fact that the current two-step process utilises a delegation in a way that was not originally contemplated when the delegation was originally approved, is it the intention of the General Manager or yourself, Mr. Mayor, to conduct a workshop in order to regularise this delegation in a way that reflects what Council is contemplating?
The problem is that Council has given no indication that it's seeking a workshop in this area. However, I will discuss it with the GM.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Alderman Kendi.
Nothing from me, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Alderman James.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Mayor. Two questions. Firstly, through you to Mr. Toohey, in his capacity as the Manager of Community Development. I think that's his title. Mr. Toohey, has Council received a further extension of time for works on the property on the corner of Clarence and Cambridge Road, Bellereve?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. No, I haven't received anything.
Okay. Second question, Alderman James.
Yeah, my second question is either to Mr. Lovell or to Mr. Graham. It refers to the Bellereve Yacht Club redevelopment. There was an original planning permit granted on the 17th of June 2019 and an amendment to the permit which was granted on the 13th of March 2020. In that, it was decided that the amendment was a change to allow construction through the year, and therefore it didn't require any formal approach to Council to confirm or otherwise that amendment. Given that the amendment has basically allowed a change, is it intended that with the new extension, which is very close to the public pier, is it going to be very difficult for the ferries to be able to manoeuvre into the Federal Hotel's wharf in order to be able to continue with the ferry operation once the extension to that arm of the Bellereve Yacht Club extension is completed?
GM, have you got any advice on that?
Yes, I do, Mayor. It's I'll try and summarise it. Not long after the ferry trial was announced and planning was underway, it was identified that the development application for the BYC Marina extension and renewal was very close to the operating area for the ferry. Subsequent to that, the Department of State Growth, Council and BYC entered into some negotiations to try and find a solution to that. And the Department of State Growth and BYC, as I understand things, have resolved that they will not build out the last row of pens next to the pier, and that there'll be a new DA submitted at some stage shortly to rearrange the marina layout further towards the shore end of Kangaroo Bay to account for that change. There's some further work to be done on that, so it's not in any way certain at this point in time. And once that work has been done, then we can expect a further DA to go through the usual process. So none of that is certain until such stage that there's been commitment between those parties and also a approved development application issued.
Thank you. Alderman Newington.
No, I'm fine, Mr. Mayor.
And Alderman Edmonds.
Thank you. A couple from me. In I think it was August, I asked, maybe October, sorry. I asked a question about replacing the concrete ripple pads, the intersection of Kerry Road and Grass Street Hill Road, and Marlock Street and Laurel Street in Risdon Vale. The subsequent answer was that there was a works order done, but I was just wondering how far away the actual work is.
Mr. Graham.
I will have to follow up on that one, Mr. Mayor, because the ripple pads are actually generally regarded as line marking, and DSG undertake the actual maintenance of our line marking on a program when they're available and ready. But I will follow up on that one and advise Alderman.
Thank you. Second one, Alderman Edmonds.
Yeah, it's more of a general question, but obviously I don't know how anyone else is travelling, but it seems like our requests for maintenance, cutting of grass, whippersnippering, etc., around the city is at an all-time high. Not only this year, but obviously for this is the time of year where we get those requests. But my question is more about workforce capacity. Do we consider that we actually have enough crews to get all of this work done?
Mr. Graham.
Through Mr. Mayor, we are battling at the moment on a number of things. Our request numbers are high. Our council staff are a little bit low through vacancies at the moment, and also our crews have been hit by COVID absences at the moment. So we are trying to reschedule things in terms of capital and maintenance to address things as quickly as possible.
Thanks, I appreciate that answer. But I wouldn't mind potentially down the track workshopping this, because when we've identified gaps in other parts of the council operations, we've had pretty honest conversations about what needs to happen from a budgetary point of view to address that, because obviously it's a fundamental role of the council. So I'd look forward to talking about that more.
Yeah, and we are approaching the budget session, which will take us into the workshops on that. So that's definitely one we can discuss in detail. Thank you. And Alderman Blomley.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, I have two questions. Both of them refer to a meeting of the 22nd of November of last year. The first one relates to council's support for my motion calling for increased police resourcing and collaboration with Tas Police to address the antisocial behaviour in and around the Rosny Bus Mall and the skate park. Could council please provide an update as to what actions have been taken, including any interactions we've had with Tasmanian Police, the management of Eastland Shopping Centre and other shopkeepers in the Rosny Park area?
Mr. Toohey, are you able to help with that one?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Since that November council meeting, the following has occurred. Tasmanian Police ran a pre-Christmas high visibility blitz in the Rosny Park area, and that was from the end of November through to end of December. It was quite successful, with reports of instances such as shoplifting decreasing markedly, almost to zero by the end of the campaign. Furthermore, this high vis exercise was reinitiated again last week, and they've started again in full force this week. And this includes officers from the Bellereve Police Station as well as the Metro Police Unit. They have already issued a number of public infringement notices, in relation to the Rosny bus mall for smoking, and it also includes an increased attendance at the skate park and at the Eastlands as well. Tasmanian Police have been working very closely with Eastlands management and also with Metro as well. Furthermore, in relation to that motion, was in respect to the skate park. What's happened since that council meeting? We have now the CCTVs at the skate park now have a direct feed to the Bellereve police station. Our youth services have increased their presence in the skate park, including skating sessions with YMCA, and we are developing a more structured program to engage young people not only in the skate park but also in the mall. And we estimate to have the program completed and started by early March. We've also done some basic clean-up and repairs to the skate park. However, more work needs to be done to the skate park. We've also been talking with our colleagues across the river, Hobart City Council, about how they dealt with some of the issues they had in relation to the North Hobart skate park. We've also had other discussions with some other organisations that provide youth services like Youth Beat to see whether they could also have a greater presence within this part of our city. And lastly, we also spoke with skate park users, which included the Sherry Shreds as well, to find out what needs to be improved in the park and also the possibility of them doing some more activities there. And finally, we continue to work with the police, Eastlands, Rosny College, Metro and other players to try and improve the safety within this part of our city. And our next meeting to review our progress and plan for any other actions will occur in the middle of next month.
Thank you. Second question, Alderman Blomley.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think Mr. Mayor, that comprehensive response. My second question concerns the decision at that same meeting to advertise our intention to enter into a 10-year lease with the Hobart Model Aero Club at Kelly Fields. So can the General Manager advise, one, if, as a result of the advertising period, any objections were received, and two, if so, what is the process from here?
Jim.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the question. Council has received correspondence during the objection period, but that correspondence did not specifically state itself as an objection. Council officers have since written to the person asking for clarification as to whether that correspondence was intended as an objection, and that hasn't been responded to yet. So going to the second part of the question, it really depends on what that response is. If the person intended to make an objection, that will be the subject of a report back to council at the next council meeting. If the person did not intend to make an objection, then council officers will proceed with renewing the lease with the Hobart Model Aero Club.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Deputy Mayor, do you have any questions?
No, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. In that case, that brings us to the end of our open council session. Could I thank those members of the public that have stayed the journey with us, and wish you a good night, and ask that the feed be closed.